Welcome, everybody. I am Shivani. Welcome to our inaugural Fireside Chat, and I'm so excited to have Audrey here. This is like a fireside chat that Ascend offers. Ascend is offers online leadership programs for women. So we work with women from companies like LinkedIn, Box, Pinterest to help them feel more confident and gain the skills to lead and influence at work. And I'm super excited to have Audrey here. We're going to go deep. She promises to get real with us about her leadership experience. Audrey is the Chief Product Officer at Clue, and previously she was a product leader at Pinterest. And before I dive in more with Audrey, I wanted to share that. So we're going to talk about me and Audrey are going to chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn it over and have some Q&A. So as you have questions, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A icon that's on the bottom right of your screen, and you can always upvote the questions. And so, Audrey, thank you so much for joining us. I am truly honored to have you join us. Audrey and I got to know each other a couple of years ago, and I think we bonded because we both moved to Berlin from San Francisco. We were both in product, a little bit over yoga too. And just as I've gotten to know Audrey, I've really admired her leadership style. I love how she's authentic, incredibly engaging, smart, and just gets things done. And so it was great having Audrey join one of our Ascend's leadership programs. She came and joined us for a private guest Q&A, and everyone loved her advice. And so I asked her to join us for our first fireside chat. And Audrey, again, thanks so much for joining us. Maybe you can share a little bit about yourself before we dive in.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you, Shivani. I mean, that's so nice. All the things you just said are so nice. It makes me feel so warm. I'm so happy to be here. I think, Shivani, we were talking about Ascend a while back when you were actually starting the whole thing. And I was just so, I guess, inspired and impressed by your mission and what you're setting out to do. So thank you for having me. And thanks everyone for joining the internet world out there. So yeah, I was, as Shivani mentioned, I'm from San Francisco. I was born and raised there actually. And maybe you can see behind me too, I'm in Berlin sitting here around 9 p.m. I have been in product management for over 15 years. Most of that was in Silicon Valley before I moved to Berlin for Clue. And yeah, I worked at Pinterest where I managed the home feed. That's the main feed. Hotel Tonight, which was later acquired by Airbnb. I started my own photo sharing app. I was the first product manager at Yelp. So I've seen, like, I guess, a wide variety of companies, mostly in the consumer space, all at different stages with different user problems and different team setups. So I'm excited to share what I can about that experience. And maybe a little bit more background on Clue and how I came to Berlin, because people ask me that a lot. What made you move to Berlin? Well, actually, in reality, it was Clue. I had been fascinated for a long time with how to apply technology to health. I wanted to make health and like mental and emotional wellness just more accessible and available to people. And I started talking to Ida, who's the co-founder CEO of Clue. And I was just like, wow, this company is doing amazing things. It has an amazing, inclusive, progressive approach to blending science and empathy and technology. And yeah, moving to Berlin sounds like a crazy idea. And it sounds like it'll be super hard because I know nobody there, but why not do some super hard things and see how I grow? So it's been an amazing experience, an amazing growth experience. And I got to meet people like Shivani. So that was plus. Yeah, I guess that's like my resume. I did promise to get real, and some of the things that I've been like thinking about lately are like, who am I? Do any of you sit there and go, but who am I? Like, really, if someone asked you that, like, who are you? What would you say? And so I thought, well, maybe I'll share, I put together my personal mission, my vision, my values. Like, that's maybe a good place to start. And then I'll also share some things I love. So my personal mission is to nurture and empower. And the vision for that is that the people I touch are living like these connected, fulfilling lives and making their own choices that result in whatever kind of impact they want to have, but, aligned and resonant. And my values are to, well, lead through empowerment. So start with why: empower, enable, trust, create safety. Second value is creativity and courage. I like to think about, what problem are we solving? Like define, what's the box, and then have fun and play thinking outside of that box. Third value is to show up, especially when it's uncomfortable or hard. We'll talk about it, but I'm an introvert, and I think I'm talking to quite a few people tonight. So this isn't like the most natural thing for me to do, but you know what? Show up, see what happens, get to know some folks, and probably amazing things will happen. So be my whole vulnerable self, see others as their whole vulnerable selves. And through all of that, hopefully I'm always going to be growing, because that's pretty important to me. Aside from that, I love making things. I love experiencing new things like travel. And I love having, deep, usually one-on-one conversations, because I'm an introvert, with people I meet. So yeah, this is starting to now sound like a dating profile and not an intro. So I'll stop there.
Favorite date? Just kidding. So that sounds great. And I loved how you dove into not just your resume, but also around, what's important to you. And that's actually the part of you that I so much appreciate every time, and just showing up and bringing your authentic self. And so, tying back to the values that you just described, how would others describe you as a leader?
So and this is literally me actually quoting some feedback that I've
perfect. Great.
Throughout my career. One, I'm clear. I'm clear in my thinking and in my communication. And these are examples where people will be like, yeah, we can pull you into a meeting if we've been talking and debating for a while, and you can come in, listen for a while, and then create a framework for moving towards a decision. So I like to think about that as clarity. They also say that I create safety, and sometimes they call it you know what, and I talk to you, and even if the world is falling apart, it always seems like you think that it's gonna be fine in the end. And it's true. I somehow do think it's going to be fine in the end, but I'm also not afraid for it to not be fine. And so I think what that means is that, at least I'd like to think, that people come to me even if it's they need advice or support, or they need to talk through something that didn't go as they planned, that I create that safe space for them to approach me, as well as take some of those risks that may result in things not going as planned. And they know that they can come to me, even if, especially throughout, let's say the last couple of months, which have been super roller coaster, and I'm sure for many of you stressful in all kinds of different ways. I like to think, and I think they do appreciate me for being able to come to me with the hard stuff, and being able to dive right into that. Aside from that, everyone says it's high user empathy. I'm kind of known for asking this question and going, hold on, what user problem are we solving? I'm a product manager, so this is what we think about all the time, but I think a lot of us, and I'll do it too, we jump to the solutions. And so I like to ask, what user problem are we solving, and constantly just remind people. So yeah, clear, safe, and high in empathy.
I love that. And I know something that, you previously talked about before is also being someone who's not afraid of having the hard conversations, and not afraid of being direct. And something that I often hear in our leadership program from the women is around, how do I balance being a leader and direct, or being leader and nice? Actually, that's more so around it, or being a leader and approachable. So, and I think you've done a really great job around that. So how do you think about those two things, which sometimes people think there's tension, and how would you approach it?
So I think what comes up a lot is that, well, yeah, as a leader, you can't be too nice, right? You can't just be like, oh yeah, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. I think that the balance of, somebody coming and saying, hey, I disagree with you, or I'm really upset by this thing. What I've found really works is when somebody says they're upset, or they're giving me feedback, in sometimes not the most constructive ways, I'll actually just get curious instead. And what that does is it creates, I think, this safety where people can go beyond that. And they can look to you as a leader from the perspective of like, oh, I don't have to listen to what they say. I can like disagree. I can think differently. I have my own autonomy, which is inspiring. But they can also trust that I'm going to really consider what it is that they're thinking, what it is that they're processing. So I'd say like one of the keys to that is making sure that you're listening, and that you're being curious, actually about any kind of interaction. Is that actually what your question?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and and it shows that tension between being a leader and approachable, or being a leader and nice, like doesn't necessarily exist, because you're right. Like if you are too nice, then you're actually not helping them lead. You're not actually helping them give direction. And I think coming from a place of curiosity can be a nice way to still reach a certain conclusion, but have the people feel more heard and listened to. So yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. And I think it's, well, I think one of the things is like actually figuring out what your shared ground is, or what your common ground is, and what your shared goal is. And so you can, I call it balancing like passion and compassion. So like at one of my last jobs, I became notorious literally in my second month for sending an email to the lead of another product. I'm not even on this product, where I pointed out with passion, because I was very passionate about this particular opinion, how a long-time assumption about, let's say, the composition of the feed was causing the feed to get boring and stale. And I think there's a way to communicate with compassion, because fundamentally, like we wanted this product to be amazing for our users. And we wanted this product to be not boring and not stale, and posing it as like, okay, how can we actually make this the feed relevant, inspiring, like all of the things that we as a team and as a company agreed were important to us, like grounding ourselves in those things, and then using that to actually build the compassionate side of a sometimes passionate disagreement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And continuing with the theme of leadership, how do you inspire your teams? And imagine like some of what you just covered probably goes into that. Is there anything else that you do to inspire your teams?
Yeah, I think, well, actually today I just came out of a day-long planning session. We're kicking off Q4 planning, and planning is always, even the process of planning is an evolving process. So I learned a lot today. We brought together product design, engineering, growth, data science, monetization. The leads all came together to kind of kick off planning today. And instead of like diving into like, okay, what are all the initiatives that we're going to have to somehow like puzzle into this roadmap for Q4 planning, we actually spent the day getting super, super clear on our shared goal. So this is the whole, how do you build like the shared goal? And I didn't know if this was actually going to work out, or if the team was going to benefit from this going into it and planning this day-long workshop. But the feedback was definitely really positive. What we did was we started with the overall company goal. It's revenue, no surprise there. But together we built like a concept map for all the things that might impact that. And what that allowed all of these different stakeholders, all these different kind of functions to do was think about, okay, well, how can, my team, or from my perspective and from my team's perspective, how might we move this one shared goal? It's like, okay, we all now agree, we have the same reasons for knowing why this goal is important. How do we think about that? And you bubble up all of these things like, okay, the engineering team has been worried this whole time that we're not spending enough time on tech debt, and that's really starting to cost us. Whereas one of our cross-function, like our product cross-function teams is like, oh, but we really need to get this thing out because it's a revenue feature, and that's going to help us, meet next month's target. And being able to create like a framework where we built out the KPIs that all led to our top line KPI and aligned on those will allow us to have a common language and a common way of actually discussing, debating the initiatives that we consider. So we're going to, next step, not even today. I mean, today was really just spent aligning. And I think the value of that actually created like a more motivated, inspired, and collaborative team dynamic, even coming out of today.
I think what you call it right there is also not trying to rush it. And so you're like, just today we just aligned on what's this framework, and then later we're gonna do it. Because so often, and I'm guilty of this too, I'll come to a meeting, we're like, okay, we're gonna discuss, and then we're just gonna move forward with it. And like, let's just reach a decision. And I'm curious, like, as you align, how are there any questions you recommend helping to drive that alignment, or tactics that you use? I know many of the people listening in on this, are from product engineering, and cross-functional is so important to that. And so any like specific strategies that you'd recommend that you found effective?
And I see like there are questions to share more on this whole idea of a concept map. I'm a PM and manager PM. It's great. So, I mean, I'll just walk through what we did today. So I started out with a Post-it note in the middle, like net revenue. And what's that, and started with a super open-ended question, like literally what things, throw them out, shout them out, what things impact net revenue. And it's a room full of people that are generally working on product. We're not certain other functions in the org. And various different things came up, everything from like specific features to, I think I'd say like categories of let's say experiment hypotheses to just like, oh, we need to make sure that we continue to grow new users because new users end up converting and all of that. And so what happens when you kind of just spread out all of these different initial ideas, then we went through the exercise of actually clustering them and adding some type of hierarchy. It's like, oh, okay, let's create now this like mental model for how each of these different either things, and literally they were things, they were everything from metrics to features to conceptual ideas. How do we actually make sense of all of this? And that was done through clustering. And we debated that for actually probably like 45 minutes together before we arrived on the, okay, so net revenue is the top line metric. We've got a few other metrics below that are literally like conversion rates, new subscriptions, etc. These are the metrics. Oh, and then we've got these pillars. And these pillars might be like quality, speed of execution, team health, etc. And we were like, oh, these pillars enable us to move these goals. And so then we were like, okay, well, what KPIs would actually help us understand whether we are like delivering a quality app that then actually affects or impacts like the likelihood for someone to convert. So it was really, first of all, a broadening to brainstorm all of the different things that impact, and then a sense-making process, which is, oftentimes something we use in design thinking, is to go broad and then to make sense of it and to prioritize and to get clear. And finally, I always cap off any kind of big group workshop like this where you come up with a list of action items and you assign owners to them and due dates and supporters. And together we basically lined up what more do we have to do in order to, like, let's say, what data do we have to collect, who do we have to align, etc., before we can even begin to assemble a list of initiatives to consider. Fill out the KPIs that we estimate these will move, the ones that we had just come up with, and then come up with some way to actually like objectively evaluate them against each other as a priority set. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, I think that's really detailed. Thanks for breaking that down. And so switching over a bit to more about your individual kind of showing up at work how, you mentioned that you're an introvert. And so I'm curious, how do you balance being an introvert with like speaking up at work and being a leader? Like how does it work for you?
Um, well, in all honesty, and I'm not saying that every introvert does this, but I was doing this. I had to take like a pretty hard look at myself and go, am I being introverted right now? Because I am an introvert. Like I'm going to be tired after this call. I know that, and that's fine. I still enjoy doing it, and I'll talk about why I love being an introvert after this. But I was like, am I being introverted or am I actually just being shy? And being shy was not who I wanted to be, because there were moments where I was like, and I wanted to become really mindful of this. I I don't know if any other introverts out there have ever sat, or any other people in general have ever sat in a meeting going, like, listening to the conversation going on and going, I have to say something, but oh, if I haven't formulated the perfect thing to say yet, and oh, I haven't quite like, logic together this piece. And so, I don't know, 2 minutes later, the conversation has moved on. You have not made your point. Literally, probably the decision or whatever that meeting was about is worse off because of it. Like, I was like, that's a moment when I'm being shy. It's nothing to do with introversion. It's like literally me like spinning in my head about something that's not actually related to the matter at hand. And so I wanted to first become really, really mindful of that. And then the second piece, like, and once I was mindful of it, I was like, okay, well, how do I kind of face this? Like, well, what's the worst thing that's going to happen if I just spit out whatever, thing is in my head? The worst thing that's going to happen is people might look at me and go, oh, that doesn't make sense. Or like, no, but that's not so bad. Or they could be like, oh, that's awesome. And either way, like, it's going to move something forward. And then the second piece is I started really loving being an introvert, because what that allows me to do, it's like the thing that a lot of people appreciate me for is they can pull me into a meeting and help them clear up their decision making. It's like I can actually listen to something that I know nothing about and go, okay, ask a question here, ask a question there, and get clear and build. I call it like an introvert's understanding of usually a room full of extroverts, like working things out loud, but not necessarily driving to some kind of conclusion. So I started really actually enjoying that. And I don't know, I guess once you start enjoying it or appreciating it, it starts to come out more in the way that I wanted to.
I think that's so key how you call it the difference between being an introvert and shy. I would also somewhat describe myself as an introvert, and I agree. There's a difference between that and just feeling comfortable enough speaking up. And so I thank you for calling that out. I think that's an important realization for us to make. Like going with kind of the individual, how do you communicate your impact at work? Oftentimes we think that results are enough, but they're not. You have to showcase that. So, what are some strategies that you use to communicate your impact?
And I think this is something that's hard because I'm taught naturally, maybe by my parents, that like you should be humble. Mm-hmm. And so communicating your work or communicating your impact feels like, oh, you're bragging. Well, so being on the other side of like receiving an email where, let's say, a PO or a product manager on my team has told me about the impact of their work, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I'm so glad I know all this information. So being on the flip side, I'm like, this isn't bragging. This is actually just creating more clarity and more visibility for everyone at the company, and especially, your manager, as to what it is that you're doing. So first of all, it's just like, don't worry about, I guess, the being humble part. But these are some of the things that, and I kind of, if I can break it down to like, okay, earlier in my career as a product manager, how did I communicate impact? Because it's slightly different than how I do now. And that was all about, well, impact was all about shipping features. And it was, I believe, like my responsibility to announce that they were shipped, usually over email, but earlier in my career was many years ago, and there were fewer things to communicate on than there are now. But communicating that they were shipped, reporting on early results or early learnings, communicating plans for improving, especially acknowledging everyone who worked on it. Not myself, but everyone else who worked on it, every single engineer, every designer, every cross-functional, product marketing, whatever, just making sure that you're acknowledging everyone and just being regular and clear for like the period, after you ship something. Then I was thinking, okay, as a lead or like a director, it's, you start to be responsible for the people that are actually doing the work. And I definitely didn't want to take any credit away from them. I wanted to make sure that they were celebrated. And what I found that I needed to do in many different projects, where I think this is actually good to do at any role that you might have, is just making sure that you've defined your role and your ownership, so that when things happen, what do you own, and what, let's say, results or metrics would indicate that you've had impact. Making sure that you know your area, and then communicate, and making sure that you're regularly communicating, constantly communicating, like, okay, how do you know, or actually you're basically holding yourself accountable for the either goals, metrics, results that you are the owner for. Holding yourself accountable by regularly, either actually weekly, reporting out on them, giving some kind of annotated, some kind of like anecdotal like storytelling around why metrics might be moving a certain way, or what kinds of changes might have led to certain things. So that's just generally, like, I'd say weekly communication of what it is that's happening with your area of ownership. And then, like, as CPO at Clue, I'm almost kind of even taking one more step back, and what's been working so far is that I make sure that there are processes in place where my teams communicate their impact. And I manage a couple different teams, and some of them, did not start out naturally wanting to report on a weekly basis. But what I found, like, let's say our growth team reports on a weekly basis their results towards monetization, and that's actually done amazing things to raise the visibility of what they're doing, as well as like get the whole company excited. So I just make sure that I'm almost like backstage in the background, that I've created the rituals or the processes that allow my teams to communicate their impact. And I almost don't communicate my impact almost ever anymore.
Got it. And when you're talking about the updates, is it email updates, or how do you recommend sending those out to people?
Well, one of the other things that I've done is actually help people understand how best to communicate with me. And I'll admit that my Slack just blows up, and it's very hard for me to keep track of everything. And so good hygiene for getting something to me, and I think getting something to the whole company in a way is generally email. I also like to encourage people. We have a weekly home meeting that's obviously a meeting. And we've actually just started this thing where each kind of functional area on a rotating monthly basis kind of just presents all the stuff that they're working on and the results that they have. And I think that that's actually really just helped raise the visibility and appreciation for what's going on in other parts of the company for everyone.
Got it. I love those practical tips. So last question for you, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. And so like if anyone has more questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A or upvote it. And so question for you is around failure. So I think we always talk about success, but we rarely talk about failure. But every success pretty much has many failures behind it. And so I'm curious, what's a failure that you've had in your career, and what have you learned from it?
I mean, there are so many failures. Which one do I pick? I mean, so I told you I started a company. It was in 2011, and long story short, we shut it down in 2013. It was a group photo sharing app. And so you have to kind of rewind back to when there were many fewer options for doing this. And I still think it was a super interesting user problem to solve. But photos is a hard business unless you have massive scale. And we did not succeed in reaching the proof points of massive scale that we needed in order to continue raising money for something that is fundamentally hard to monetize, because so many other options like Facebook, et cetera, were giving away photos for free. So I've spent quite a bit of time unpacking like what went wrong there. And it's fine, you know, some things that you do, they will fail. Like it's a business. You tried it, we experimented with it, we, you know, raised money, launched multiple versions, iterated on it, pivoted. We did all of those things. And I don't actually view any of those necessarily as failures, even though, yes, the product failed. I think the one thing that I'm taking away is that there were so many points where I felt like I was doing everything that I thought I should be doing, as opposed to what I really needed to be doing. And so, you know, that's like, okay, it may have even started with like, oh, I should go start a company. Like, what's next for me? I don't know. I should go be a co-founder. Oh, well, we should raise money. We should raise like angel seed, like venture money. Okay, we're going to build a venture-backed business. Silly things like we should buy a nice coffee machine because that makes people happy. And worrying a lot. And there were also things like, oh, well, so-and-so did ASO this way, and, you know, we should look at the competition this way and that way. Like there was so much worrying about how others succeeded. And I admit, like looking at some of the Silicon Valley success stories and go, oh, they did it that way. Maybe we should too. And that was just a lot of wasted time, as opposed to just digging in and going, okay, well, what do we need to do right now? What are like the most important, like the big anchors that will help us propel this forward? Or should we completely rethink, you know, the fact that we are venture backed? Like maybe we should find some other way and reinvent how we look at our business model. So takeaway is like, yeah, I'm not saying like reinvent the wheel, but almost like don't pay so much attention to how it's what other people are doing, and just do what you do and do what you do really well.
Yeah, I really love that. That really resonates with me because, as you know, as becoming now a founder and entrepreneur, is often it's so easy to go back and look at what other people do. Or even when I was in product, going back and looking like, okay, how are our competitors building our product, build their products, and just realizing like you have to figure out what works for you and what works for your customers and just creates a better experience. And so I think that's such a key insight there. And we actually have a question in the chat related to failures. Maybe we can cover that, talking about when it comes to leadership, how do you process failure?
Process it like emotionally, process it personally, or like process it for my team.
Maybe it's probably, why don't we take it like personally? If as you fail as a leader, how do you process that for yourself?
Well, I process it. And what does that mean? I think like a lot of times what we're doing is not processing things, like especially like uncomfortable, painful things that we might like beat ourselves up over. Like this is failure. Like, oof, that's I don't even want to. Maybe I'll like blame something else for it. And I think the best way to move on is to actually say like, okay, I'm going to own it. I'm going to own that I made a mistake. I'm going to own honestly, and I'm going to own it to other people that really need to know that I made this mistake, like the management team. And then from there, I'm going to be like, okay, what can I learn from it? Because I think, you know, I love the culture that we have at Clue, which is actually very there's a lot of emotional safety there and a lot of space for processing failure, but also a lot of space for like learning from it and then translating that into like, okay, what's the next big dream that we still have? and the big way to look at this that would be transformative.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that. So going with the theme of leadership, we have a question in the Q&A around what are some questions you encourage individuals on your team to think about to help them grow?
What are some questions that I would encourage folks on my team to think about to help them grow?
Yeah.
So I always actually check in the beginning when I start to manage anybody or a new manager relationship. I check in and I go, what's important to you? You know, what actually do you want to be doing? And that can feel strange as a manager because it's like, but what if what they want to do, we as an organization can't or not in a position to support? But I think there's always trust to be built there by even just listening and knowing what matters to somebody on my team. So I ask them to think about it. Sometimes a lot of people will say, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure what it is that I want. I don't have some big dream of, I don't know, like, you know, my 2-year, 5-year vision for where to go. And it's like, okay, well, then you should really consider it. Or if you think that that's it, like, let's explore that more and really figure out what matters for you here. So I guess it's fundamentally always being aware of like what's meaningful for you. And if there's, you know, ever a point where it's like, oh no, this doesn't quite feel right, like to actually ask like another layer of questions, like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like what's, I don't know, you can think of it as asking five whys, or really like trying to dig deeper into like what's actually meaningful. But I think we can all benefit from doing something that we care about and that fulfills us. We'll do better work naturally. So that's starting there. On the kind of personal development side. On the flip side, well, you know, from a product perspective, I always start by asking, what user problem are we solving? Let's not jump to conclusion or to solutions quite yet. Let's really get clear on what user problem are we solving, and then let's make sure, does that user problem matter? Like, should we be solving that user problem? And then beyond that, it's like, okay, well, can you validate? Like once you're in solution mode, it's like, how quickly can you validate that? Okay, you could do that. Could you do that in even less time or with less complexity? Like, could you simplify that even more? And getting that out there. And then literally, like, how will you know you've succeeded? What metrics, what indicators, how will you know you've succeeded in, now looping back to the user problem that we set out to solve? And how will you know that that user problem actually helps us as a company be a healthy business?
Yeah, I love that. And tied to that, there's a question in the chat around, how do you help your team grow when they make mistakes and failures? So I think it's not just about them growing to stand alone, but it's helping them overcome mistakes and failures.
I generally think that it's good to face your failures, like I mentioned before, and you know, for me, that's about facing it with them. It's like, okay, tell me about it. It's gonna be okay. Like, I hope that they understand that as their manager or as an executive, like, the buck stops here. You know, like, ultimately, I'm responsible for mistakes, and that's okay because I can absorb that failure with you. And so I often ask, like, okay, what's actually happening, and what can we learn from it? And on the flip side, it's like, I think it's good to face the failures, but it's also really great to celebrate the wins, however small they might be, is to take a step back and to really like recognize and acknowledge what is going well. Because there is something transformative there about learning and moving through that failure. when you actually can look at the flip side as well.
Yeah. And then there's, on the individual side, there's a question in there around how do you balance work and life?
How do I balance work and life? So I actually, there's a book called Designing Your Life. And I used to facilitate workshops for Designing Your Life. It's a very like design thinking approach to being mindful of the things that are important to you, and then actually consciously designing a life that you want to live. And so when it comes to work-life balance, like oftentimes people are like, oh, this is a trade-off. If you have work, then you can't have life. And I'd like to actually question and reframe that. Like, this is about actually defining the problem. Like, I mean, I guess I asked myself, like, well, why would I want work-life balance? Do I even want work-life balance? Or ultimately, do I just want to be happy? Mm-hmm. And for me, that's not a trade-off necessarily between work and life. It's actually understanding like what parts of work and what parts of my personal life make me feel great. And how do I get more of those and not like just one or the other, and breaking it down to even more elements. It's like it might actually be work, love, health, and fun or creativity. Like when you think about it as all of those things, it actually introduces like, well, which of these things are actually important to me, instead of just lumping it together as work and life. And so that's the Designing Your Life model for it. And I feel like it's actually really resonated with me when it comes to just digging a little bit deeper. And beyond that, in all honesty, I've learned a lot about work-life balance moving to Europe. I don't know how many attendees are in Europe or in Berlin, but there's a different culture when it comes to things like taking vacation or making time for your family, and making time for yourself. And I think it's much healthier here than perhaps it used to be. But that's, I think it's always on us to design, like, let's say, what our own boundaries are. However your work, love, health, fun, or whatever your dimensions are for happiness and fulfillment, like designing the boundaries such that you can fit it all in. Or maybe you can like double some things up. Maybe there's I don't know. Like a good example is at work, we have Tuesday lunchtime workout sessions. I love either doing yoga or boot camp or whatever. And so here I can spend time getting to know my colleagues and be healthy at the same time. Like this is this nice kind of overlap. And I look at moments like that and I'm like, what other moments of overlap can I do if I only have a limited number of hours in a day? But beyond that, just knowing what's important.
Yeah, I think that's so important. How you call it, like trying to find what do you really enjoy and how can you bring both those elements into work and life is really important. And so we have a question in the chat around your leadership path. And maybe you can share, as you moved in from a PM to being an individual contributor to becoming a product leader, what did that look like for you? Like, what are some lessons learned that you would share with others as they make that transition?
So the interesting thing about being a PM is that it's actually like, compared to other functions, you don't begin managing people for quite a while, because oftentimes the product management scales along with engineering, and engineering has to like add, let's say 6 to 10 more people before they'll add another PM. And so often I felt like there were points in my career where I was like, I'm never going to manage people. And that made me unhappy for a while until I was like, okay, I'm going to choose a place where I actually see a growth path towards management because it makes sense in that organization. And it was an organization that was at a scale where I could be managing. And that's literally where I took my first manager of product managers role. And I learned a lot. And what I learned is that, it's great to start with like, just let's say 2 directs. Like, because once you hit 3, it becomes a lot crazier. For some reason, I don't know why. And I've talked about this to other managers at previous companies and before, where it's like, okay, 2 is great, but 3 starts to just multiply in complexity. And so that was the next step. So after I was managing 1 or 2 people, I actually ended up switching companies, not because I didn't think there was more like career growth potential there. I just wanted to go work on a different product that I cared more about. And that's where I got a chance to manage more people. And I think a clue, my team is about 20 people. And that's a really exciting challenge. And it's meant a trade-off in like I'm almost not hands-on at all, whereas at different points in my career, when I managed fewer people, there were still many hands-on things. I would still write specs, I would still write requirements, I would still be doing the analysis and the reporting, and I don't do that anymore. I don't also get to like work on designs anymore and any of that, and I also miss that. But yeah, that's, sometimes you kind of have to actually switch companies in order to change your management development track.
Yeah, that's so true. What and how do you kind of make, as you move into leadership, and you've talked about how it's different when you have 2 people versus a larger team. What do you like? What helped you move into that larger team? What are some kind of like key things that are important to keep in mind as you make that transition?
I think it's some key things to keep in mind. I mean, obviously, like, folks are looking at your performance to understand whether they should give you more responsibility. And managing more people generally means that you're either managing a bigger product or you're literally responsible for more people that are having more impact. So definitely creating, a track record, communicating clearly your impact, building allies within the company that want to collaborate with you and will speak for you, and will recommend you for moving on to projects or products or areas of the company that require you to manage more people. And then oftentimes it's like, if you're successful at scaling whatever product or product area you own, you'll have to actually build your team as well to reflect that. So take that almost into your own hands for going from managing fewer people to more. It's like, okay, you're going to have to grow the product, create the business case and the rationale and the strategy for how you're not only going to do the product strategy, but the operational organizational strategy as well.
Yeah. And last question for you is, what's a piece of career advice that you have for the group?
Like, don't resist whatever's uncomfortable, like lean into the hard things, and whatever that might be for you. For me, it was speaking up, or actually talking about failure, or getting angry at work. One of the things that I've been working on is actually getting more angry, because I think I was so nice before. So whatever that might be, however uncomfortable that might be, like, just lean into it and go for it. Because every time I've done it, I've always learned something about myself. And I've always felt this like just sense of like, oh, I'm growing. Like I don't know, like it's like I can feel it in my bones that I'm like stretching and growing and seeing the world in different ways. It's incredibly rewarding. It keeps me going, and it definitely ends up producing results and making your experiences at companies or in roles or starting companies like super just memorable and impactful.
I love that. How do you get the courage to lean into it?
Well, what's the worst thing that can happen? I guess I'm also a coach, and I often ask people that, like, what's the worst thing that can happen in this, like, whatever scenario they've played out in their heads. And every time people are always like, okay, fine. If I honestly tell you, like, it's not going to be that bad. Nothing that bad is actually going to happen. Um, and and it's a combination of like trusting in yourself, that you generally approach things with kindness and compassion and rational thoughts, and you bring like all of your analytical thinking, etc. You put your best, you tried your best. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen if it's wrong, or it fails, or whatever? Not much. The worst thing is that, okay, you stop for a second and then you restart and you've learned something and you can go do something even bigger.
Yeah, that's so true. You're right. Like often in our head, it just feels like the world is coming to an end. But when we actually dig into it, it's usually not that big of a deal. And in the leadership program, often it's around even speaking up in meetings. And it's like, oh, like what happens? In reality, most of the time, your comment just falls flat. And people move on. No one remembers it. And so, agreed. Like just leaning into it. I really love that. And so thank you so much for today. Maybe, I want to make sure everyone is able to like really remember and take away some actionable takeaways. So maybe we can spend about 30 seconds and in the chat, just put in like, what's one thing you're going to take away from our conversation today? For me, it's just that leaning into it and remembering what's the worst thing that's going to happen. Because if you don't do it, then you'll never know. Mm-hmm. So I just love to read yours in the chat. Balancing passion and compassion. I like that. So don't worry about the result. Good outcomes will happen. Nice. Wow, I love all these. Introverts. I think some people really, so much of what you said really resonated with people. That's so great. Well, Audrey, thank you again for joining us and for just sharing all your learnings and advice. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Of course. And everyone else, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the great questions and all the interaction in the chat. I will send out the recording to you, and we'll also share information with you for future Fireside chats if you're interested in joining. And thank you again. Stay safe and well, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.